I met Yury a couple of times in recent years. One he may not remember in Dublin in the Institute of Public Administration 6-7 years ago, I think it was, when he introduced his concepts of business-driven action learning. And more importantly, a couple of years ago in Henley, where Yury was talking about the extensive research he's done in Reg Revens, and also made a plea for the greater linking of all of the organisations involved in action learning all around the world, from Yury's organisation to ourselves, etc. So, as I said, my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for the morning, Yury Bosher.
Well, it's only 20 minutes for me to cover a pretty broad range of things. So, as you can see, it's about Revens, it's about action learning and the evolution of action learning, and of course it's about this topic, which is virtual action learning. So what I'm going to do is spend less time on the Revens side, because we can discuss that if you wish. I'm happy to discuss it. Maybe the thing to say with Revens' idea of action learning is that it's essentially a moral philosophy and an approach. And I think the moral philosophy aspect is very critical, because that, I think, will help us think about how we would have reacted to Twitter and other technologies. I've also asked other people around the world how they think Revens would have reacted to the modern technologies. I've asked Verna Willis and Charles Handy, many other people who knew Revens, just to see what their perspective. So I'll be sharing that with you as well in these 18 minutes left from two. I would probably say from the beginning that it's very important to appreciate that the process, the technology, the logistics that Revens used really begins to be clarified in his mind and publicly in 1972, when he was 65 years old, when he was in fact on the verge of coming back to the UK from his exile in Belgium, as he put it. And from this point of view, the first published mention by him is in 1972 in an article, and later in 1976 in a book on hospitals. Before then, he used various words to describe what he was doing. And it's very important for us to remember that he talked about action research, action science, even people working with him had different ideas of what this was. But 72 is the starting point, which I wanted to clarify. Make sure we understood this, because from 65, the years of 65 to his ultimate demise at the age of 94 in 2003, his time was spent in clarifying process and, of course, philosophy. And the person who probably publicized his thinking most was Nancy Foy, the late Nancy Foy, who passed away, I believe, last year. She, I think, probably helped him clarify his thinking on this, and also the term action learning. There's a lot of confusion as well. If that's Revens' starting point, the American version of action learning starts in a different place. And it starts really with Kurt Lewin, organizational development, most importantly from the US Army, who started a whole school at Fort Ord for developing what they called organizational effectiveness officers, who later went into the corporate world, like the GEs, and to my chagrin, I saw that some people thought they had invented action learning, people like Noel Tishy and others, whom I also spoke to, and they have a completely different tradition that does not come from the Revens orientation at all. So when we talk about action learning and its perception of virtual action learning, the Americanized version would be quick to adapt it and adopt it, because, of course, to them, action learning was not a philosophy, a moral philosophy for sure not. It was an approach to solving project work. As Nancy Dixon correctly said several years ago, it is essentially about task forces and getting project work done. And that was fully understandable to the American perspective. So that's one very important point too, that the other form of action learning, which is very popular in companies, is more on the project side, and therefore they would be very willing and adapt this very quickly. It's no surprise that IBM is the leader in this area, and having developed Second Life, for example, they use it extensively for what we call cultural induction of people who join the company for the first time, and they're putting a lot of money into Second Life. Another school, or another approach, for action learning that has a different perspective too, is action reflection learning, which is really the influence of people like Miel in Sweden, together with Victoria Marsick from Columbia, and that's really influenced, again, from the American perspective, especially by Jack Mesereau, and his idea of transformational learning. So again, that school, or that approach, would certainly be very willing to use these methods, and they do on occasion. And part of this whole approach is, of course, Michael Marcotte's World Institute of Action Learning. Coming from the American perspective, they have no trouble adapting this because these are approaches which aren't practical things. There are other approaches to this too, which I've just mentioned in brief, but I think I've given you an idea of where you stand is where you sit. So if you're in the traditional action learning space, obviously you have a different perspective, as you would from the American side too. The other thing I wanted to mention as background is that when does the process of what Revens call logistics come into place? And that's really with the GEC program in 1974. Before then, there was no use of sets. He did have some assumptions behind this, of course, but the trouble with Revens is that he was always backdating stuff. So he would say that nurses were part of action learning, the colliery experiment was action learning. But if we are very realistic about the process, it really starts with the GEC program for General Electric Company, for Weinstock, which later became Marconi and so on. And what's important there is that it wasn't done by Revens. It was done by people like David Casey, David Pierce, Loring, I think, and a whole group of people that were part of this initial experiment. And that's where they clarified the thinking. The set, for example, comes from David Casey, from what I could tell in talking to a lot of people, like Gene Lawrence, the late Gene Lawrence and others. They really put the details onto this, facilitators and things like that. There are some myths surrounding Revens' reaction to all these logistics, which we should mention. One is the fact that he was not against facilitators categorically. There's a kind of aggressive style to his writing and speaking, as you well know. So sometimes we have to take that into account. But there were moments when he was not against what we would call, in Heron's words, kind of autonomous facilitation, where you intervene when asked. Likewise, another myth which has come about is that he was adamant in implementation of insights and recommendations. And this is not correct either. Sometimes he realized that you couldn't implement, you couldn't do the action on the action learning. You had to pass it on to others to do that job too. Now there are other things that one could mention about some of the mythology about action learning, but those are just some of them. So this is why I'd like to turn maybe to another question, which is, would Revens have approved of some of these new technologies? And I would have to say my answer would be a little bit like Truman's concern about finding a one-handed economist. Remember that statement where he said, why can't I find a one-handed economist? Every time I talk to one, it's either, well, on the one hand, this issue, and the other hand, another perspective, and he couldn't get clarity. So in a way, I'd have a mixed comment on this from my perspective. On the no side, I'd have to say that he would probably not have approved of this approach, especially because I guess his principle of insufficient mandate is really important to him. The idea that you yourself have to make the change in order to have others change. You have to be aware of your learning in terms of tackling a problem and ensuring you should change in the process as well as you solve the problem. And he said this had to be observable behavioral change. Observable behavioral change. This is why he was very negative towards some things like T groups, we called it at that time T groups, as you know, and all kinds of groups that were talking about self-awareness, but he was more interested in seeing it in action as a real change. This may have come from his Quaker influence background. He was not a Quaker officially. I don't think he would have joined any society anyway. But certainly he was not a Quaker, but he's strongly influenced by the idea that Quakerism also looks at the action more than just the talk. One actually walks the talk, and other things like his pacifism and so on. I believe, and the set ideas partially also comes from that too.